The dust motes danced in the solitary beam of sunlight that pierced the gloom of the attic, each one a tiny world, spinning through the heavy, silent air that carried the weight of decades. The scent was overwhelming, a mixture of old cedar, decaying paper, mothballs, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of a life lived in quiet desperation. Samuel, a man whose weathered hands told stories of distant wars and whose quiet demeanor concealed depths forged in harsher climates than this peaceful valley, pried open the lid of a heavy, iron-strapped trunk with the reverence of a man opening a tomb. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty house below, a cry of metal that had been silent for far too long. Inside, beneath a neatly folded dress uniform that still smelled faintly of starch and service, lay a worn leather camera case, cracked and softened by age. He lifted it with hands that trembled slightly, not from frailty but from an emotion he couldn't name. It was his father's old Argus C3, a beautiful, clunky piece of machinery from an era when photographs were deliberate acts, not casual afterthoughts. As he unfastened the stiff brass buckle, his fingers brushed against something that didn't belong in this museum of the past, something cold and metallic that made his pulse quicken. Tucked into a carefully concealed slit in the leather lining was a small USB drive, its presence so anachronistic, it felt like discovering a smartphone in a Roman ruin. At that precise moment, Max, his magnificent German shepherd, who had been sitting in patient vigil beside him, suddenly rose with an urgency that commanded attention. The dog moved forward, his powerful body tense with an intelligence that never ceased to amaze Sam, and let out a low, questioning whine that seemed to vibrate with meaning. Max nudged first the camera, then the small digital device with his wet nose, his amber eyes fixed on Sam with an intensity that transcended simple canine curiosity. It was as if the dog, in his primal wisdom, understood that these two objects represented something far more dangerous than memories. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so we can continue to bring these stories to light. In these quiet moments, guided by the uncanny intuition of his four-legged partner, Sam realized that cleaning out his father's house had just transformed into something infinitely more perilous. Sam had come to the remote tranquility of Autumn's Hollow, not seeking adventure, but answers to questions that had haunted him since his father's funeral. He needed to understand the profound, crushing loneliness that had enveloped his father, Thomas. Like a shroud in his final decades, a self-imposed exile that had always felt more like penance than preference. The inheritance was more than property. This rustic log cabin with its wide front porch and hand-hewn beams, the towering pines that stood like silent, ancient sentinels in their perfect rows, and most mysterious of all, the heavy, oppressive silence his father had chosen over human companionship. But Sam had not ventured into this emotional wilderness alone. Max was more than a pet, more even than a loyal companion. He was a living, breathing anchor to the present, a steadying force against the treacherous currents of memory that threatened to pull him under. The magnificent German shepherd, with his thick sable coat and ever-watchful amber eyes that missed nothing, was the partner Sam had chosen after his own wars had supposedly ended. Their bond had been forged not through commands and obedience, but through the deeper language of shared silence, through the gentle but insistent pressure of Max's massive head against his knee during the sleepless nights when desert ghosts came calling, through the dog's supernatural ability to sense the approaching shadow of a painful flashback and ground him with a soft lick to the hand, or a deep, calming sigh that seemed to say, "I'm here, and you're safe." The valley itself possessed a haunting, melancholy beauty that seemed almost too perfect, a living painting of deep emerald greens and rich, dark earth where secrets could lie buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and forgotten seasons. Sam felt like an archaeological intruder, a reluctant detective sifting through the emotional debris of a life he had only partially understood, trying to reconstruct the man his father had become in this beautiful, isolated purgatory. And Max, with his preternatural awareness and unwavering loyalty, served as both guide and guardian in this deeply personal excavation, his instincts proving far more reliable than any map or compass could ever be. The small brass bell above the door of Eleanor's emporium chimed with a sweet musical note that seemed to welcome visitors into a different world entirely. The shop was a wonderfully chaotic labyrinth of forgotten treasures and recovered memories, its narrow aisles winding between towering shelves loaded with antique furniture, vintage clothing, old books, and curiosities from every decade of the 20th century. The air was perfumed with the comforting scents of old paper, hand-polished wood, dried lavender sachets, and the faint vanilla smell of aging leather. Eleanor Vance herself was a treasure. A woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that seemed to hold not just the town's history, but its very soul. She greeted Sam with a smile that reached those perceptive eyes, one of the precious few people in Autumn's Hollow who spoke of his father, Thomas, with genuine warmth instead of whispered suspicion. Sam explained his mission with careful words, placing the corroded roll of film on the polished glass counter like an offering. Eleanor examined it with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades coaxing secrets from old things, nodding with understanding and professional interest. As she prepared to take the film to her darkroom, the cheerful bell chimed again, this time with more force, announcing an arrival that changed the very atmosphere of the cozy shop. A large, imposing man in an expensive tailored suit that screamed of city money and rural arrogance strode through the door, as if he owned not just the building, but everything in it. Sam recognized him immediately from faded photographs in the town hall and newspaper clippings as Harold Bishop, the wealthy real estate magnate whose name appeared on half the businesses in the county and whose influence reached into every corner of local politics. The transformation in the shop was immediate and chilling, as if someone had opened a window to let in a blast of Arctic air. Eleanor's warm, welcoming smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of rigid, barely controlled civility that spoke of deep, abiding hatred, held in check only by decades of forced politeness. But even more striking was the reaction from Max, whose response was as dramatic as it was immediate. From his relaxed position at Sam's feet, where he had been patiently observing the treasure-filled shop with mild interest, the dog rose in a single, fluid motion that spoke of coiled power and instant readiness. A low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself, began to vibrate in his chest. His hackles rose like the crest of an angry wave, transforming his silhouette into something primitive and dangerous, and he deliberately, purposefully placed his powerful body squarely between Sam and the newcomer, a living shield of muscle and protective instinct. Sam placed a calming hand on Max's neck, feeling the tension thrumming through every fiber of the dog's being like a high-voltage wire ready to discharge. He had never, in all their time together, seen Max react to anyone with such immediate, visceral hostility. The dog's controlled but unmistakable aggression, perfectly mirrored by the icy disdain radiating from Eleanor's suddenly rigid posture, was more than a warning. It was a declaration of war written in a language older than words. An hour later, Sam found himself in the hushed sanctuary of Eleanor's back room, where time seemed to move differently and the outside world felt safely distant. The small space was dominated by larger equipment, chemical baths, and the tools of a craft that predated the digital age. Everything arranged with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting their art. The air was thick with the sharp, acrid scent of developing chemicals, a smell that spoke of transformation and revelation. Eleanor worked with the focused grace of a master craftsman, her movements economical and purposeful, as she guided the images from their silver prison into the light. The dim red safe light cast everything in an otherworldly glow, making the process feel less like photography and more like seance, summoning ghosts from the chemical depths. Sam watched as she clipped the dripping strip of negatives to a line to dry, her weathered face illuminated by that ethereal light, showing an expression that mixed professional concentration with a deeper, more personal sorrow that seemed to age her before his eyes. Finally, with the solemnity of a priest performing a sacred ritual, she handed him a small stack of glossy prints, still damp with chemistry and possibility. Most of the photographs were exactly what he had expected to find. Stark, beautiful landscapes of the valley rendered in the dramatic blacks and whites that only film could achieve, each one a testament to his father's artistic eye. Several awkward self-portraits that showed a younger Thomas, his face already carrying the weight of some unnamed burden despite his relative youth. But the final photograph was different in every way that mattered, and looking at it sent a chill through Sam's entire body. It felt like holding a scream that had been frozen in silver and time, captured by someone whose hands had been shaking with fear or urgency. A young woman with wide, terrified eyes stood before the dark, menacing mouth of what appeared to be an old mining structure, its weathered timbers framing an entrance into absolute hungry blackness. Above her, barely visible in the deteriorating photograph, hung a faded sign that read Ironwood Mine in letters that looked like they were bleeding rust. Behind the woman, partially obscured by shadow but undeniably threatening, loomed the silhouette of a man whose very presence seemed to radiate malevolence. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper when she confirmed what Sam already knew in his heart. The terrified young woman was Evelyn Reed, the bright, passionate environmental activist who had vanished without a trace 50 years ago, taking with her all the hopes and dreams she had carried and leaving behind only questions that had never been answered. This image, this frozen moment of absolute dread, was more than evidence. It was a map, showing him exactly where the terrible truth had been buried. Sam's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, cool metal of the USB drive, and he felt the pieces of a half-century-old puzzle beginning to align with terrible clarity. If the photograph was the destination, the final resting place of justice denied, then the small piece of modern technology hidden away by his father was undoubtedly the key that would unlock the reasons why Evelyn had to die. Eleanor poured tea with hands that trembled just enough to make the fine china rattle against itself, a sound like distant wind chimes in a storm. Her movements were careful and deliberate, but Sam could see the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders as she set the delicate cups on their matching saucers. When she finally spoke, looking not at him but at the photograph of Evelyn Reed spread on the table between them, her voice carried the pain of someone who had been forced to keep terrible secrets for far too long. "Your father was a good man, Sam," she began, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her mind 1,000 times, but never found the courage to have it until now. "Such a truly good man trying to do right in a town that has always preferred simple, comfortable lies to complicated, inconvenient truths. The valley has a long memory, but it's selective about what it chooses to remember, and it's always been easier to blame an outsider than to admit that evil can wear a familiar face." The story she told him was a masterpiece of small-town character assassination, a slow-burning poison that had destroyed his father's life drop by drop over the course of decades. After Evelyn Reed disappeared into the mists of local legend, the official investigation had quickly stalled and been quietly shelved, leaving the town hungry for answers and willing to accept any narrative that would let them sleep at night. Thomas, a relative newcomer who had arrived in the valley with a journalist's curiosity and an outsider's determination to ask uncomfortable questions, had been seen spending time with Evelyn in the weeks before her disappearance, researching her environmental activism and the industrial interests that opposed it. In a community where privacy was sacred and secrets were currency, their professional relationship had been twisted into something darker by whispers that started in the general store, spread through the post office, and grew like a cancer over backyard fences and church socials. They said he was obsessed with her, that their relationship had crossed professional boundaries, that a man his age had no business spending so much time with a young woman unless his intentions were impure. When no body was found and no arrest was made, when the investigation faded into bureaucratic oblivion, the suspicion didn't disappear. It metastasized, clinging to Thomas like the valley's persistent fog that rolled in every morning and never quite burned off completely. His continued efforts to investigate on his own, driven by a journalist's integrity and a decent man's outrage at injustice, were reframed and reinterpreted through the lens of community suspicion, seen not as a search for truth, but as the desperate machinations of a guilty man trying to throw investigators off his scent. Every question he asked became evidence of his guilt. Every lead he followed became proof of his obsession, until his very persistence in seeking justice became the weapon used to destroy him. Sam listened to this catalog of character assassination with a cold, hard knot of rage building in his stomach, understanding for the first time that his father's isolation hadn't been a choice made freely, but a life sentence imposed by a community too cowardly to face its own complicity in letting a killer walk free. This wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about redemption, about clearing the name of a good man who had died carrying the weight of a crime he never committed. Back at the cabin, as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and deep purple that seemed to bleed through the windows and stain everything with melancholy, Sam sat before his laptop in the gathering darkness. The only sounds in the house, the electronic hum of the machine, and Max's steady, reassuring breathing as the dog maintained his vigilant watch. The small USB drive felt almost supernaturally heavy in his hand as he plugged it into the port, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the silent rooms. The device was heavily protected, wrapped in layers of encryption that spoke of his father's deep understanding of the danger these secrets represented. But Sam's military training had included more than marksmanship and battlefield tactics. He had been taught to think like the enemy, to anticipate their moves, and most importantly, for this moment, he had learned the digital arts of modern warfare. For the next hour, he existed in a state of pure focus, his mind sharp and clear as winter air as he methodically worked through each barrier his father had erected, treating it like a conversation across time between two men who understood the stakes involved. His fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence, each successful penetration of the defenses bringing him closer to his father's truth. It was digital archaeology, reconstructing not just information but intention, not just data but desperate hope that someday someone would care enough to finish what he had started. Finally, after what felt like hours of electronic chess played against a ghost, a single correct password opened the final door, and a hidden partition materialized on his screen like a message from beyond the grave. What he found there took his breath away with its scope and meticulous organization. A complete archive of his father's secret investigation, decades of patient, dangerous work pursued in the shadows, while the town that had branded him a pariah went about its daily business. There were geological surveys that had been buried by bureaucratic red tape, financial records showing massive discrepancies in Harold Bishop's logging operations, environmental impact studies that had been suppressed or destroyed, and most damning of all, chemical analyses of water samples that painted a picture of systematic, criminal ecological destruction spanning decades. The crown jewel of the archive was a series of encrypted email exchanges between a younger, more careless Harold Bishop and a shell corporation with ties to organized crime. Messages that explicitly discussed bribing environmental inspectors, silencing government officials, and disposing of industrial waste in ways that would contaminate the valley's groundwater for generations. As Sam scrolled through document after document, each one a smoking gun in what should have been the trial of the century, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air settling around him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that opening that final encrypted file had triggered something his father had never intended. A digital tripwire, a silent alarm that had been waiting patiently for 50 years to sound. Miles away, in a sterile office within Harold Bishop's mansion, a computer monitor flickered to life in the darkness, displaying a simple but terrifying message. Archive Thomas Reed.dat accessed-user. Samuel Reed-timestamp confirmed. The secret that had cost his father everything was finally exposed, but so was he. The counterattack came with the surgical precision of a military operation and the ruthless efficiency of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying his enemies. Sam's first indication that the war had begun came at 8:30 the next morning, standing in the fluorescent-lit aisle of the town's only general store with a gallon of milk in one hand and his debit card in the other, watching the digital display flash "Card declined" in merciless red letters. The young cashier, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion that made his stomach clench with sudden understanding. A phone call to his bank's customer service line, conducted from the parking lot with growing dread, revealed that his account had been frozen pending investigation into what a bored-sounding representative described as suspicious activity patterns consistent with identity theft or fraud. The accusation was so transparently false, so obviously manufactured, that it could only represent a deliberate act of financial warfare orchestrated by someone with the resources and connections to manipulate the banking system itself. By the time he returned to the cabin, his hands shaking with a combination of rage and disbelief, a certified letter was waiting for him, taped to his front door like a death warrant. The thick envelope bore the letterhead of Richmond's most expensive law firm, and its contents read like a declaration of total war. A formal cease and desist order accusing him of criminal trespassing, defamation of character, harassment, and a dozen other charges that would have been laughable if they hadn't been accompanied by the threat of litigation that could drag him through the courts for years and bankrupt him in the process. The legal document was a masterpiece of intimidation, each paragraph carefully crafted to convey the message that Harold Bishop had unlimited resources and unlimited patience for destroying anyone who dared to challenge him. But the psychological warfare was just beginning. As Sam walked through the town later that day, trying to understand the scope of the attack against him, he could feel the poison that Bishop had injected into the community's bloodstream beginning to take effect. The few friendly faces that had greeted him during his first weeks in the valley were now closed to him, replaced by averted eyes and suspicious whispers. Doors that had been open were now shut. Conversations stopped when he approached, only to resume in hushed tones after he passed. He caught fragments of the narrative that Bishop was weaving through his network of influence and intimidation. Heard he's been up at the old mine, digging around where he doesn't belong, and, just like his father, stirring up old troubles that are better left buried. The campaign of character assassination was devastatingly effective precisely because it echoed the same themes that had been used to destroy Thomas Reed decades earlier, tapping into the community's collective memory of suspicion and fear. Sam realized with crystalline clarity that Bishop was using the exact same playbook that had proven so successful in the past, weaponizing the town's capacity for gossip and turning neighbors into unwitting accomplices in his campaign of destruction. But Harold Bishop, for all his wealth and influence, had made one critical, potentially fatal miscalculation. He thought he was fighting the ghost of Thomas Reed, a broken man who had spent his final years in bitter isolation, when in reality he was facing Samuel Reed, a combat veteran who had been trained to fight and win against overwhelming odds. Sam knew that time was his enemy now, that every hour he delayed gave Bishop more opportunities to tighten the noose around his neck. But he also knew that accusations without proof were just noise, and digital evidence without physical corroboration could be dismissed as fabrication. He needed something tangible, something current and undeniable that would transform his father's decades-old investigation from historical curiosity into present-day criminal prosecution. The creek that snaked down from the abandoned ironwood mine represented his best chance of finding that proof, so he packed a small field kit with the methodical precision of someone who understood that this might be his only opportunity to gather the evidence that could bring down Harold Bishop once and for all. Max trotted silently at his side as they made their way through the dense forest, the dog's ears constantly moving as he monitored their surroundings with the alertness of a trained sentry. The walk to the creek took them through some of the most beautiful terrain Sam had ever seen, towering pines and ancient oaks that formed a cathedral ceiling high above their heads. But he found himself unable to appreciate the natural beauty because every shadow could hide a threat, and every sound could herald an ambush. When they finally reached the water, the evidence of Bishop's crimes was immediately obvious. The creek near the old runoff pipes had an unnatural, oily sheen that caught the filtered sunlight in rainbow patterns, and the air carried a faint but unmistakable chemical odor that made his eyes water and his throat burn. Sam knelt on the muddy bank, feeling the cold moisture seep through his jeans, and carefully filled a sample vial with water that should have been crystal clear but instead looked like it had been contaminated with industrial waste. As he screwed the cap tight and labeled the vial with a waterproof marker, Max suddenly went rigid beside him. Every muscle in the dog's powerful body coiled with tension. The German Shepherd's ears swiveled like radar dishes, picking up sounds that Sam's merely human hearing couldn't detect, and a low, warning growl began to rumble deep in his chest, a sound that spoke of immediate and present danger. Sam followed the dog's intense gaze and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Partially concealed behind a massive pine tree roughly 50 yards away, a large man in a muddy hunting jacket was making a poor attempt to look casual while obviously watching them. Even from this distance, Sam could see that it was one of Bishop's foremen, a man whose face he recognized from his brief, uncomfortable encounters in town. The surveillance was no longer covert. It had become a hunt. "Move, Max!" Sam commanded in a low, urgent tone, breaking into a hard run even as he heard the sound of pursuit crashing through the underbrush behind them. The forest floor was a treacherous obstacle course of fallen logs, tangled roots, and hidden holes that could snap an ankle or send a runner tumbling. But Sam's military training kicked in automatically, his body remembering lessons learned in far more dangerous terrain than this peaceful valley. As he vaulted over a moss-covered log, his combat experience screaming warnings at him, he heard the sharp crack of a breaking branch somewhere to his left, and knew with absolute certainty that they were facing more than simple surveillance. A second man was moving to flank them, turning this from a chase into a classic pincer movement, designed to trap them between two hostile forces. Just as the second pursuer was about to step out from behind a massive oak tree to block their escape route, Max demonstrated why German Shepherds had been chosen as military working dogs for over a century. With a sudden, explosive bark that echoed through the forest like a rifle shot, the dog veered sharply to the right, crashing through a dense thicket of mountain laurel as if chasing a phantom deer or pursuing some scent that only he could detect. The sudden noise and movement, so unexpected and dramatic, caused both pursuers to instinctively turn their attention toward the sound, their heads swiveling to track what they assumed was their fleeing quarry. That single moment of distraction was all the opening Sam needed. With the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to disappear in hostile territory, he changed direction in a heartbeat, using Max's brilliant tactical diversion to melt into a grove of rhododendrons whose thick, waxy leaves provided perfect concealment. Max joined him seconds later, slipping through the vegetation with the silent efficiency of a ghost, and together they lay motionless in their green sanctuary, listening to their frustrated pursuers thrash through the woods like amateur hunters, their curses and complaints growing fainter as they moved away from the hidden fugitives and deeper into the forest that had swallowed their quarry without a trace. Lying motionless in their leafy sanctuary, the adrenaline from the chase slowly ebbing away to be replaced by a cold, tactical clarity that Sam recognized from his military service, he forced himself to analyze the situation with the dispassionate precision of a professional soldier assessing a battlefield. The game had changed irrevocably and catastrophically in the span of a single morning. He was no longer Thomas Reed's son conducting a quiet investigation into his father's mysterious past, no longer a grieving man seeking answers in the dusty corners of local history. He had become the primary target of an active manhunt orchestrated by one of the most powerful men in the valley. A man whose reach extended into every corner of the local power structure and whose resources seemed limitless. The speed and coordination of Bishop's response, from the surgical financial attacks that had left him essentially penniless to the physical surveillance and pursuit that had just nearly trapped him in the woods, told him everything he needed to know about his adversary's capabilities and ruthlessness. Harold Bishop wasn't just corrupt. He was desperate, cornered like a dangerous animal who had suddenly realized that the secrets he had spent 50 years burying were clawing their way back to the surface. And desperate men, as Sam had learned in far more violent theaters than this peaceful valley, were predictable only in their willingness to cross any line and break any rule to protect themselves. Staying at the cabin was no longer an option. It had become a trap, a kill box where Bishop's people could corner him at their leisure. Every moment he remained in that familiar sanctuary gave his enemies more time to tighten the net, to use Bishop's vast wealth and political influence to completely isolate him from any hope of help or rescue. The methodical investigation he had planned was now impossible. The time for careful research and deliberate fact-gathering had been stolen from him by forces beyond his control. But Sam had not survived 2 tours of duty in hostile territory by accepting defeat when the odds turned against him. The USB drive and the water sample were powerful evidence, but they were digital and circumstantial, the kind of proof that expensive lawyers could challenge and discredit in court. The final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun that could cut through 50 years of lies and corruption with the irrefutable force of physical truth, was waiting for him at the Ironwood mine. It was there that Evelyn Reed's remains lay hidden, along with whatever evidence she had died trying to protect. His mission parameters had shifted from investigation to infiltration, from research to rescue operation. He had to reach that mine and recover that evidence before Bishop's forces could stop him permanently. The decision crystallized in his mind with the sharp clarity of a combat order, and Sam began moving with the purposeful efficiency of a soldier who had accepted a dangerous mission and committed himself completely to its success. He couldn't return to the cabin. Bishop's people would be watching it, waiting for him to make that predictable mistake. Instead, he would have to live off the land, using the survival skills the military had drilled into him during countless training exercises in environments far more hostile than these familiar mountains. Max seemed to sense the change in their situation, the shift from peaceful exploration to tactical operation, and the dog's entire demeanor became more alert, more focused, his movements taking on the controlled precision of a working animal who understood that the game had become deadly serious. They moved through the forest with the careful discipline of a reconnaissance team, avoiding trails and clearings, staying in the deep cover of the oldest trees where the canopy was thick enough to hide them from aerial observation and the undergrowth was sparse enough to allow quiet movement. Sam's military training asserted itself automatically, his body remembering lessons in camouflage and concealment that had once meant the difference between life and death in places where the enemy was always watching. Every 100 yards, they stopped to listen, to scan their surroundings, to ensure they weren't being followed or observed. The forest that had seemed so peaceful and welcoming just hours before had been transformed into a battlefield where every shadow could hide a threat and every sound could herald danger. As they worked their way deeper into the wilderness, moving in a wide arc that would eventually bring them to the Ironwood mine from an unexpected place direction, Sam found himself thinking about his father, about the decades Thomas had spent living under the weight of suspicion and isolation, knowing the truth but unable to prove it, watching his enemy prosper while justice remained forever out of reach. The thought filled him with a cold, hard determination that went beyond personal vindication. This was about honor, about finishing a fight that had been forced on his family 50 years ago by a man who believed that wealth and influence could bury any truth and silence any witness. As afternoon faded toward evening and the shadows began to lengthen between the trees, Sam and Max found themselves approaching the Ironwood mine from the north, a direction that would allow them to observe the site without being seen from the main access road where Bishop's people would most likely be watching. The abandoned mining operation sprawled across a natural clearing in the forest, its rusted machinery and collapsed buildings creating an industrial graveyard that seemed to absorb the fading light and radiate an aura of desolation and danger. From their concealed position behind a fallen tree that provided perfect cover, Sam could see that the mine wasn't as abandoned as it appeared from a distance. Fresh tire tracks in the mud led to a cluster of newer buildings near the main shaft, and security cameras mounted on tall poles swept the area with mechanical precision, their red LED indicators blinking like malevolent eyes in the gathering dusk. This wasn't just an old mining site. It was an active operation, carefully disguised to look abandoned while continuing whatever illegal activities had made Harold Bishop wealthy and powerful enough to control an entire community. The realization that he was looking at the nerve center of Bishop's criminal empire, the place where decades of environmental crimes had been planned and executed, sent a surge of grim satisfaction through Sam's combat-trained mind. He had found the target, the objective that would justify all the risks he was about to take. But even as he studied the layout of the facility, noting the positions of the cameras and the likely placement of motion sensors, he became aware of something else, something that made his blood run cold with a combination of anger and tactical concern. This was more than just a hidden industrial operation. It was a fortress, designed and equipped to keep out unwanted visitors and protect the secrets buried within its perimeter. Getting inside would require more than stealth and determination. It would demand all the skills he had learned in places where failure meant death and success meant survival for another day. The sound of his cell phone buzzing in his pocket nearly made Sam jump out of his skin, the electronic noise seeming impossibly loud in the forest silence that surrounded their hidden position. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call, letting it go to voicemail rather than risk revealing their location to anyone who might be listening. But the caller ID made him reconsider. It was Police Chief Miller, the man whose name had appeared in several of his father's notes as someone who might be sympathetic to the investigation. Someone who might represent the last hope for official help in a community that seemed completely under Bishop's control. With Max watching alertly for any sign of movement from the mine complex below, Sam answered the call with cautious optimism, hoping against hope that he had finally found an ally in what felt like an increasingly hopeless situation. Miller's voice was warm and concerned, exactly what Sam needed to hear at that moment of desperate isolation. "Sam, I've been hearing some disturbing rumors around town," the police chief said, his tone suggesting genuine worry for Sam's safety and well-being. "Word is that Harold Bishop isn't happy about you stirring up old memories, and I'm afraid he might try to cause you some serious trouble. I think we need to meet and talk about this situation before it gets out of hand." The offer of help, of official protection and intervention, was exactly what Sam had been hoping for, but something in Miller's tone triggered the combat veteran's finely tuned instincts for deception and manipulation. There was something too smooth about the chief's words, too convenient about his sudden concern, too perfectly timed to be entirely genuine. Sam found himself remembering his father's notes, the careful observations about which local officials could be trusted and which ones had been compromised by Bishop's influence, and he realized with growing certainty that Miller's call was not a rescue, but a trap. The police chief was offering to meet him at the Ironwood mine, claiming it was the safest place to talk without being overheard, but Sam's military training was screaming warnings about the tactical impossibility of that suggestion. No law enforcement officer would choose to meet a civilian at an abandoned industrial site, especially not when that site was connected to an active criminal investigation. This was an ambush, carefully disguised as a rescue attempt, designed to lure him into a killing ground, where Bishop's people could deal with him permanently and make his death look like an accident or a suicide. Sam's response was carefully calculated to sound grateful and unsuspecting, while buying him time to plan his next move. "That sounds like exactly what I need, Chief Miller," he said, injecting just the right amount of relief and gratitude into his voice. "I'll head over to the mine right now and wait for you there." "Thank you for looking out for me." He ended the call and immediately turned off the phone, removing the battery to prevent any possibility of electronic tracking, his hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been trained to think 3 steps ahead of his enemies. The conversation had confirmed his worst suspicions about the level of corruption in Autumn's Hollow and the extent of Bishop's control over local law enforcement, but it had also provided him with a crucial tactical advantage. He now knew that his enemies were expecting him to walk into their trap, which meant he could turn their own plan against them by approaching the situation with full knowledge of their intentions. This was no longer about avoiding confrontation. It was about choosing the time and place for a battle that had become inevitable. Miller and Bishop thought they were luring a desperate, frightened civilian into their carefully prepared ambush, but what they were actually facing was a combat veteran who understood that sometimes the only way out of a trap is to spring it on your own terms. Sam looked down at Max, whose intelligent eyes reflected the same grim determination that was building in his own mind, and felt the familiar cold clarity that came with accepting a dangerous mission. They were walking into hell, but they were walking in with their eyes open and their weapons ready, and that made all the difference between victory and defeat, between justice and the continuation of 50 years of unpunished crimes. The approach to the Ironwood mine complex required every skill Sam had learned during his military service, every lesson in tactical movement and stealth infiltration that had been drilled into him during countless training exercises and real-world operations. With Max moving beside him like a ghost made flesh, they worked their way down the wooded slope that overlooked the mining facility, using every scrap of cover the terrain provided to mask their advance from the electronic eyes that swept the perimeter with mechanical precision. The security measures around the site were far more sophisticated than what any legitimate mining operation would require, confirming Sam's growing certainty that he was approaching the operational center of Bishop's criminal empire, rather than simply an abandoned industrial site. Motion sensors hidden among the trees created invisible barriers that had to be carefully avoided. Infrared cameras mounted on camouflaged poles provided overlapping fields of observation that required precise timing to circumvent, and pressure-sensitive devices buried in the most obvious approach routes would alert the defenders to any conventional assault. But Sam's training had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario, and he moved through the defensive network with the patient, methodical precision of a professional who understood that haste was the enemy of success, and that one mistake would mean death or capture. Max proved to be the perfect partner for this type of operation, his natural stealth and heightened senses allowing him to detect threats that Sam's human limitations might have missed, while his intelligence and training enabled him to follow complex hand signals that allowed them to communicate without sound. As they finally reached the edge of the industrial complex itself, crouched behind a rusted piece of mining equipment that provided perfect concealment while offering a clear view of their objective, Sam felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and focused determination that came with crossing the line from preparation to action. The next few hours would determine whether 50 years of injustice would finally be answered, whether his father's memory would be vindicated, and whether Harold Bishop's reign of corruption and violence would finally come to an end. In the distance, he could hear the sound of vehicles approaching along the main access road, the rumble of engines that announced the arrival of Miller and whatever backup he had brought to spring what they believed was a foolproof trap. But Sam was no longer the hunted. He had become the hunter, and the game was about to begin on his terms. The moment Sam stepped out from behind the rusted mining equipment, abandoning the concealment that had protected him and announcing his presence to the men who had come to kill him, the entire atmosphere of the abandoned facility changed from one of patient waiting to explosive tension. Chief Miller stood near the entrance to the main shaft, his uniform neat and official-looking in the harsh glare of the portable floodlights that had been set up around the perimeter. But the two men flanking him were clearly not law enforcement officers. They wore civilian clothes, but moved with the rigid discipline of private security contractors, their hands resting casually but meaningfully near the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. The sight of Sam emerging from the darkness seemed to catch them off guard. They had expected a frightened, desperate man stumbling into their carefully prepared trap, not a combat veteran who moved with the controlled confidence of someone who understood exactly what kind of game they were playing. "Sam!" Miller called out, his voice carrying just the right note of relief and concern to maintain the fiction that this was a rescue operation rather than an execution. But even as the police chief spoke the words, his eyes were calculating distances and angles, assessing the tactical situation with the cold professionalism of someone who had done this before. Sam continued his approach, his hands visible and empty, playing his part in the deadly charade, while his combat-trained mind catalogued every detail of the scene before him. The positioning of the lights created deep shadows between the buildings, shadows that could provide concealment for additional threats he couldn't see. The entrance to the mine shaft yawned behind Miller like a mouth waiting to swallow him, and Sam realized with crystalline clarity that the plan was simple and brutal. They would kill him here and dispose of his body in the depths of the abandoned mine, where it would never be found. His disappearance would be explained as the tragic end of a mentally unstable veteran who couldn't handle the stress of investigating his father's past. Just another casualty of war who had finally succumbed to his demons. It was a perfect plan, except for one critical miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a victim, when in reality they were facing a predator who had chosen this moment and this place to end a war that had been going on for 50 years. The confrontation that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare, each man probing for weaknesses while maintaining the veneer of civilized conversation that masked the lethal intentions simmering just beneath the surface. Miller continued his performance as the concerned public servant, expressing worry about Sam's mental state and suggesting that he needed professional help to deal with the trauma of losing his father and the stress of returning to civilian life. "You've been through so much," the police chief said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Combat veterans often struggle with paranoid thoughts, seeing conspiracies where none exist. Harold Bishop is a pillar of this community, a man who has created jobs and brought prosperity to the valley. These wild accusations you've been making are the product of a mind that has been damaged by war and grief. The words were carefully chosen to provoke, to make Sam angry and careless, to transform him from a thinking opponent into an emotional reactor who could be easily manipulated and controlled. But Sam's military training had included extensive preparation for psychological operations, and he recognized the technique for what it was. Instead of rising to the bait, he allowed a slight smile to play across his lips, the kind of expression that suggested he knew secrets that his enemies could only guess at. "You're right about one thing, Chief," he said, his voice calm and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I have been through a lot. But that experience taught me how to recognize the difference between friends and enemies. And right now I'm looking at men who drove all the way out here in the middle of the night not to help me, but to make sure I never leave this place alive." The mask of false concern slipped from Miller's face for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath. And Sam knew that the time for pretense was over. The two security contractors moved slightly, adjusting their positions to provide better fields of fire, their hands sliding toward their weapons with the smooth efficiency of professionals who had done this dance many times before. The killing ground was prepared, the players were in position, and all that remained was for someone to make the first move that would transform this tense standoff into open violence. The explosion of action that followed was as sudden as it was brutal, an eruption of violence that shattered the nighttime silence and sent wildlife fleeing in all directions. One of Miller's contractors, a large man whose patience had apparently reached its limit, lunged forward with the obvious intention of ending the standoff through physical force rather than continuing the charade of conversation. But he had made the critical error of underestimating his opponent, treating Sam like a civilian rather than a combat veteran, whose reflexes had been honed by years of life-and-death encounters in far more dangerous places than this peaceful valley. Sam's response was immediate and devastating, his body moving with the fluid precision of someone who had been trained to fight and win against multiple attackers. As the contractor reached for him, Sam sidestepped with balletic grace, using the man's own momentum against him while delivering a devastating elbow strike to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. But even as Sam dealt with the first attacker, Miller was drawing his service weapon, the barrel swinging toward Sam with deadly intent. It was Max who saved his life, the German shepherd launching himself from the shadows with a snarl that sounded like something from humanity's darkest nightmares. The dog's powerful jaws clamped down on Miller's gun hand with bone-crushing force, and the police chief's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the metal buildings as his weapon went spinning into the darkness. The second contractor, seeing his partner down and his employer disarmed, made his own move, pulling a pistol from a shoulder holster with the smooth efficiency of a professional killer. But Sam was already in motion, combat training taking over completely as he closed the distance between them with explosive speed. The two men collided in a tangle of grasping hands and desperate violence, fighting for control of the weapon that would determine who lived and who died in this forgotten corner of the world. During the struggle, as they rolled across the rough ground between towering pieces of mining equipment, the gun discharged repeatedly, the muzzle flashes strobing through the darkness like lethal lightning. But it was Sam's military training and superior conditioning that ultimately prevailed, allowing him to wrench the weapon away from his opponent and end the threat with a precision that spoke of extensive combat experience. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed the gunfight, with Max maintaining his grip on Miller's mangled hand and the two contractors neutralized, Sam found himself standing at the edge of a precipice that was both literal and metaphorical. The entrance to the mine shaft yawned before him like a gateway to hell itself, its black depths seeming to swallow the light from the flood lamps and radiate an aura of menace that made his skin crawl with primitive fear. Miller, his face contorted with pain and rage, used his uninjured hand to pull something from his utility belt, and Sam realized with growing horror that it was a small, military-grade explosive device, the kind of compact demolition charge that could bring down a building or collapse a tunnel system. "You think you've won?" Miller snarled, his voice thick with pain and the bitter satisfaction of a man who had accepted defeat but refused to go down alone. "You think Harold Bishop is going to let you walk away from this place with what you know? This mine has been keeping secrets for 50 years, and it's going to keep one more." His thumb hovered over the detonator, and Sam realized that the police chief intended to collapse the entire shaft system, burying not just the evidence of Bishop's crimes, but Sam himself in a tomb of rock and twisted metal. The explosion, when it came, was not the massive detonation that Miller had intended, but something smaller and more focused, the result of Sam's desperate lunge forward in an attempt to stop the destruction. In the chaotic struggle that followed, as the two men fought for control of the device, the charge went off prematurely, its force directed not at the support pillars of the mine shaft, but at the wooden platform they were standing on. The ancient timbers, weakened by decades of exposure to moisture and chemical contamination, gave way with a sound like the world breaking in half. Sam felt himself falling, plummeting through space and darkness toward depths that seemed to have no bottom. His last conscious thought before impact being the sound of Max's desperate howl echoing from somewhere impossibly far above. Consciousness returned to Sam slowly and painfully, like emerging from a deep, dark dream into a reality that was somehow even more nightmarish than what his mind had conjured during his period of unconsciousness. He found himself lying on a narrow ledge of rock and rotted timber roughly 30 feet below the surface, his body a symphony of pain that spoke of impact trauma and possible internal injuries. Above him, the opening to the mine shaft was visible as a small circle of star-filled sky that seemed as distant and unreachable as another galaxy. His left leg was pinned beneath a massive wooden beam that had fallen with him, and every attempt to move sent fresh waves of agony shooting through his nervous system. The air around him was thick and stagnant, tainted with the chemical smell of decades-old industrial contamination and the earthier scent of decay and death. As his eyes adjusted to the profound darkness that surrounded him, he became aware that he was not alone in this underground tomb. Scattered around the ledge were the remnants of what had once been a human being, bones that had been picked clean by time and the small creatures that made their homes in the depths of the earth. A tattered piece of fabric clinging to one of the ribs, its color long since faded to an indeterminate gray, was all that remained of what had once been a bright yellow dress. The same dress that Evelyn Reed had been wearing in the photograph his father had taken 50 years ago. He had found her at last. The young woman whose disappearance had set in motion the chain of events that had destroyed his father's life and brought him to this moment of reckoning in the bowels of the earth. But the discovery brought no satisfaction, only a crushing sense of mortality and the growing realization that he was about to join her in death, that Harold Bishop's secrets would remain buried along with their bodies in this forgotten catacomb. Above him, he could hear the sound of machinery, the rumble of heavy equipment being brought to bear on the problem of his survival. Miller's voice, distorted by distance and echoing strangely in the confined space, drifted down to him. Seal it up. Bring in enough concrete to make sure nothing ever comes back up from down there. They were going to entomb him alive, filling the shaft with quick-setting cement that would create a permanent grave marker for secrets that were too dangerous to be allowed to see the light of day. The sound that saved his life was faint at first, so soft that he almost dismissed it as a hallucination born of pain and oxygen deprivation. But it grew stronger and more insistent until even his damaged consciousness could no longer ignore it. Max was barking, the deep, commanding bark of a German shepherd who refused to be ignored or dismissed, and the sound was moving, growing fainter and then stronger as the dog searched desperately for help. Sam's heart, which had begun to slow with the onset of shock and blood loss, suddenly surged with renewed hope as he realized that his four-legged partner had not abandoned him, had not given up the fight, even when the situation seemed completely hopeless. The dog was doing what military working dogs had been trained to do for over a century. He was going for help, using his intelligence and determination to find the resources needed to complete a rescue mission that was beyond his individual capabilities. Through the haze of pain and approaching unconsciousness, Sam could hear Max's barking growing more distant as the dog left the immediate area of the mine, following whatever plan his canine mind had formulated for bringing back the cavalry. The thought of Max running through the dark forest, navigating by instinct and memory to reach someone who might be willing to help, gave Sam the strength to fight off the seductive pull of unconsciousness that threatened to drag him into dreams from which he might never wake. In the distance, barely audible through the layers of rock and earth that separated him from the surface world, he could hear the sound of Miller's men working to seal the shaft, their equipment grinding and rumbling as they prepared to bury him forever. It was a race between salvation and entombment, between Max's desperate mission and Bishop's final solution, and Sam could only lie still and wait to see which force would prove stronger. The rescue that followed was a masterpiece of coordination and determination, orchestrated by a German shepherd whose intelligence and loyalty had transformed him from pet to tactical commander in the space of a few desperate hours. Max had covered miles of rough terrain in record time, navigating by scent and memory through forests that would have challenged an experienced human hiker, to reach the ranger station, where Sarah Jenkins was pulling a late shift, reviewing reports and monitoring radio traffic from the various emergency services that covered the vast wilderness areas of the county. The dog's arrival at her door was nothing short of miraculous, his urgent barking and obvious distress immediately alerting her that something was catastrophically wrong somewhere in her jurisdiction. Sarah had worked with search and rescue dogs before, had seen how their training and instincts could lead human rescuers to people who would otherwise never be found. But she had never witnessed anything quite like Max's performance that night. The dog led her directly to her emergency equipment locker, barking frantically at the rappelling gear and technical rescue equipment that would be needed for a shaft rescue, then ran to the wall map of the area and placed his paws on the exact location of the ironwood mine. His meaning was unmistakable. Someone was trapped underground at that specific location, and time was running out. Sarah's training kicked in automatically as she called for backup from the county's technical rescue team, the volunteer fire department, and every available emergency medical technician who could respond to what was clearly going to be a complex and dangerous operation. But even as she coordinated the official response, she knew that time was the critical factor, that whoever was trapped in that mine might not survive the hour or more it would take for the full rescue team to assemble and deploy. So she made the decision that would ultimately save Sam's life. She grabbed her personal rescue gear, loaded Max into her ranger vehicle, and raced through the dark forest toward the ironwood mine, trusting that backup would follow as soon as humanly possible. The scene that greeted Sarah when she arrived at the mine was one of barely controlled chaos, with Miller's men scrambling to pack up their equipment and flee the scene before the arrival of law enforcement backup that Max's successful mission had set in motion. The police chief himself was nowhere to be seen, having apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and abandoned his position the moment it became clear that their carefully planned cover-up was about to be exposed. The concrete mixer that had been brought in to seal the shaft permanently was still running, its rotating drum filled with the quick-setting cement that would have created an impenetrable tomb. But the men operating it had fled when they heard the approaching sirens of the emergency vehicles that were converging on the site from all directions. Sarah's first priority was to assess the situation and determine whether a rescue was even possible. So she positioned herself at the edge of the shaft and called down into the darkness, her voice echoing off the stone walls as she tried to make contact with whoever was trapped below. Sam's response, weak but clearly audible, sent a surge of relief through her entire body as she realized that the victim was still alive and conscious, still fighting to survive despite what must have been horrific injuries and impossible circumstances. Working with the efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this type of emergency, she began setting up the technical rescue system that would be needed to extract Sam from the depths of the mine, using Max as her assistant and coordinator as the dog continued his tireless efforts to help save his human partner. The German Shepherd seemed to understand exactly what was happening, positioning himself where he could watch both the rescue operation and the surrounding area, alert for any sign that Miller or his men might return to finish what they had started. The extraction itself was a triumph of technical skill and sheer determination, a testament to the training and equipment that allowed modern rescue teams to retrieve people from situations that would have been hopeless just a few decades earlier. Sarah's expertise with rope rescue systems and confined space techniques, combined with the sophisticated gear that filled her emergency vehicle, made it possible to establish a secure anchor point and lower herself into the mine shaft to assess Sam's condition and begin the delicate process of freeing him from the debris that had pinned him to the narrow ledge. Working by the light of powerful LED lamps that turned the underground nightmare into a well-lit workspace, she was able to determine that while Sam's injuries were serious, they were not immediately life-threatening if he could be extracted quickly and transported to a hospital with trauma facilities. The wooden beam that had trapped his leg was massive and positioned in such a way that moving it carelessly could cause further injury, or even send both of them plummeting into the deeper recesses of the mine shaft. So Sarah employed a combination of mechanical advantage and careful timing to lever the beam aside and free her patient from his rocky prison. But even as she worked, she was aware of the historical significance of what surrounded them in that underground chamber. The skeletal remains of Evelyn Reed, still wearing the tattered remnants of the dress that had made her a local legend, lay nearby like a silent witness to 50 years of injustice and cover-up. Scattered around the bones were other objects that had survived the decades. A water-stained notebook filled with what appeared to be environmental data, a small camera that still contained undeveloped film, and most significantly, a metal briefcase that had been protected from the elements by its position under a rock overhang. These artifacts represented the evidence that Evelyn had died trying to protect, the proof of Bishop's crimes that had cost her life and destroyed Sam's father's reputation. The moment when Sam finally saw sunlight again, when Sarah's rescue system lifted him slowly and carefully up through the shaft toward the circle of sky that had seemed unreachably distant just hours before, was one of profound emotional catharsis that went far beyond simple relief at surviving a life-threatening ordeal. As he emerged from what had been intended as his tomb, surrounded by the flashing lights of emergency vehicles and the concerned faces of paramedics and rescue personnel, he was immediately aware of Max's presence. The German shepherd's wet nose nuzzling his face and his warm body pressed against his side in a display of pure joy and relief that brought tears to Sam's eyes. The dog had not only saved his life through his desperate run for help, but had remained at the scene throughout the entire rescue operation, standing guard and offering whatever assistance his canine abilities could provide to the human rescuers who were working to extract his partner from the underground trap. The reunion between man and dog was a moment of pure emotional truth that spoke to the deepest bonds that can exist between species, a demonstration of loyalty and love that transcended the merely human and touched something fundamental about the nature of companionship and dedication. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Sam's injuries and prepare him for transport to the hospital, Eleanor Vance arrived at the scene. Having heard about the rescue operation through the emergency services radio network that connected all the volunteers and first responders in the county, the elderly woman's face was a mixture of relief, vindication, and profound sadness as she looked upon the evidence that was being carefully extracted from the mine shaft, the proof that would finally clear Thomas Reed's name and expose the truth about Harold Bishop's decades of criminal activity. The aftermath of the rescue was a whirlwind of activity that transformed the sleepy valley of Autumn's Hollow into the center of a media circus and criminal investigation that would eventually reach all the way to the state capitol and beyond. The evidence recovered from Evelyn Reed's makeshift tomb was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications, painting a picture of environmental crime and corruption that spanned multiple decades and involved numerous public officials at every level of government. The briefcase that had lain hidden beside her bones contained not just documentation of Bishop's illegal dumping operations, but also financial records showing bribes paid to inspectors, judges, and politicians, along with correspondence that revealed the existence of a criminal network that extended far beyond the boundaries of the small mountain community. Harold Bishop himself was arrested at his mansion while apparently attempting to flee the country with several suitcases full of cash and gold, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling as the full extent of his crimes became public knowledge. Police Chief Miller, found hiding in a motel room 3 counties away, quickly agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, his testimony opening up new avenues of investigation that would eventually bring down dozens of other conspirators who had profited from Bishop's environmental crimes and the systematic cover-up that had protected them for so long. The story became national news, a David and Goliath tale that captured the public imagination and demonstrated the power of individual determination in the face of institutional corruption and injustice. But for Sam, lying in his hospital bed with Max curled up beside him in defiance of every hospital regulation about animals in patient rooms, the most important victory was not the criminal prosecutions or the media attention, or even the financial compensation that would eventually come from the civil lawsuits that were already being filed against Bishop's estate. The most significant triumph was the vindication of his father's memory, the public acknowledgement that Thomas Reed had not been an obsessed stalker or a dangerous man, but a journalist and truth seeker who had sacrificed his own reputation and happiness in pursuit of justice for a young woman who had died trying to protect the environment and expose the crimes that were poisoning her community. The memorial service held for Evelyn Reed was attended by hundreds of people, including environmental activists from across the country who came to honor her sacrifice and celebrate the fact that her death had not been in vain. Sam spoke at the service, his voice strong despite his injuries, telling the assembled crowd about his father's lifelong dedication to finding the truth and his own determination to finish the work that Thomas had started. He held his father's old camera in his hands as he spoke, the device that had captured the final image of Evelyn Reed and set in motion the chain of events that had finally brought justice to Autumn's Hollow. The camera would eventually be donated to a museum dedicated to investigative journalism, where it would serve as a reminder that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that take generations to tell, and that the pursuit of truth is a legacy that can be passed from father to son like any other inheritance. 3 months after the rescue that had exposed 50 years of corruption and environmental crime, Autumn's Hollow began the slow, careful process of healing from wounds that had festered in darkness for far too long. The transformation was both physical and spiritual, as obvious as the heavy machinery that rumbled through the valley to begin the massive cleanup of Bishop's contaminated sites, and as subtle as the way neighbors began to look each other in the eye again after decades of whispered suspicions and carefully maintained silences. The ironwood mine itself had been sealed permanently, but this time with the full authority and oversight of state environmental agencies who ensured that the closure would prevent further contamination rather than simply hide evidence of past crimes. New water treatment facilities were constructed with funds from the massive fines levied against Bishop's estate, systems designed to slowly but steadily remove the chemical pollutants that had been poisoning the valley's groundwater for generations. Sam found himself at the center of this renewal, no longer an outsider seeking answers about his father's mysterious isolation, but a respected member of the community whose courage had made redemption possible for an entire town. The cabin that had once felt like a lonely monument to his father's exile had been transformed into something warmer and more welcoming. A place where neighbors stopped by to check on his recovery, and where children came to visit Max, who had become something of a local celebrity due to his role in the dramatic rescue operation. The financial settlement from the various lawsuits against Bishop's estate had provided Sam with more than enough resources to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But more importantly, it had funded the establishment of the Thomas Reed Foundation for Environmental Justice, an organization dedicated to supporting investigative journalists and citizen activists who worked to expose corporate environmental crimes. The foundation's headquarters, built on land that had once been part of Bishop's industrial empire, served as both a practical resource for environmental investigators and a symbolic reminder that truth, however long delayed, would eventually prevail over corruption and cover-up. The bond between Sam and Max had been tempered by their shared ordeal into something that transcended the usual relationship between human and animal companion, becoming a partnership built on mutual respect, absolute trust, and the kind of unshakable loyalty that can only be forged in moments of life and death crisis. As Sam sat on the wide front porch of his father's cabin on a warm September evening, watching the sun set over the valley that had once seemed so hostile and mysterious. Max lay beside him with the contentment of a dog who knew his place in the world and was satisfied with the role he had chosen to play. The German Shepherd bore his own scars from their underground adventure, a slight limp from injuries sustained during the rescue operation, and a network of healed cuts across his muzzle from his desperate attempts to dig through the debris that had blocked the mine entrance. But these physical reminders of their ordeal seemed only to enhance his natural dignity and intelligence. Sam often found himself marveling at the depth of understanding that existed between them. The way Max could sense his mood and respond appropriately without any verbal communication. The way the dog positioned himself to provide physical support when Sam's own injuries flared up during periods of overexertion. The way Max seemed to take pride in the letters and photographs that arrived regularly from environmental groups and journalism schools that wanted to honor both of them for their role in exposing one of the longest-running environmental cover-ups in American history. Their evening ritual of sitting together on the porch had become a form of meditation for both of them, a time when the urgency and drama of their shared adventure faded into peaceful memory, replaced by the simple satisfaction of a job completed and justice finally served. Sam would often reach over to scratch behind Max's ears, and the dog would respond with a soft sigh of contentment that seemed to say everything that needed to be said about loyalty, courage, and the bonds that can form between species when they face danger together. The memorial service for Thomas Reed, held on the first anniversary of the day Sam had discovered his father's camera and begun the investigation that would transform both his own life and the future of Autumn's Hollow, was attended by hundreds of people who came to honor a man whose dedication to truth had cost him everything but had ultimately made possible the redemption of an entire community. Sam stood before the assembled crowd in the town square, the same space where his father had once been treated as a pariah and a suspect, and spoke about the complex inheritance that children receive from their parents. The way that unfinished business can be passed down through generations like genetic material, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring it to completion. He talked about the loneliness his father had endured, the decades of isolation and suspicion that had been the price of his unwillingness to abandon the search for justice, and about the way that sacrifice had ultimately made possible not just the exposure of Harold Bishop's crimes, but the larger victory of truth over power, of individual courage over institutional corruption. In his hands, Sam held the old Argus C3 camera that had started everything, its worn leather case and scratched metal body bearing witness to the long journey from that first mysterious photograph to the final revelation of Evelyn Reed's fate and the evidence that had been buried with her. As he spoke about his father's legacy, about the importance of finishing fights that others have started, about the responsibility that comes with inheriting not just property, but purpose, Sam felt the presence of Thomas Reed not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living force that continued to inspire and guide. The camera would eventually be donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where it would become part of an exhibit on investigative journalism and citizen activism. But its real legacy was not as a museum piece, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important inheritance a parent can leave a child is not money or property, but an example of what it means to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. The bond between a person and their dog is one of life's greatest gifts, a relationship that can provide comfort in times of sorrow, courage in moments of danger, and a sense of purpose that transcends the ordinary challenges of daily existence. If you have a story about a loyal companion who changed your life, who stood by you during difficult times, or who helped you discover strengths you didn't know you possessed, please share it with us in the comments below. We read every single comment, And your stories of loyalty and love help us understand the profound connections that can exist between humans and the animals who choose to share our lives. The courage that Sam and Max showed in their fight for justice is not unique to them. It exists in countless relationships between people and their four-legged partners, in the quiet heroism of everyday life, and the extraordinary bonds that form when two souls recognize each other as kindred spirits. And if you believe these stories of courage and loyalty deserve to be told, if you think it's important to honor the memory of people like Thomas Reed, who sacrifice everything for truth and justice, please consider subscribing to our channel to join our community of people who understand that the most important battles are often fought by ordinary individuals who refuse to accept that corruption and cover-up will always triumph over honesty and integrity. Thank you for joining us on this journey into Autumn's Hollow, for witnessing the story of a father's sacrifice and a son's determination to finish what was started 50 years ago. Your support makes it possible for us to continue bringing these stories to light, to honor the memory of people who fought for justice even when it cost them everything, and to celebrate the extraordinary loyalty and intelligence of the animals who stand beside us in our darkest hours. Sam and Max's story is one of many that deserve to be told. Stories of ordinary people who do extraordinary things when circumstances demand courage and principle. Another story of bravery and determination is waiting for you on the screen right now, ready to take you on a new journey of discovery and inspiration. Click on it to continue exploring the connections between humans and animals that make life meaningful. And remember that every story we tell is a tribute to the bonds that make us stronger and the courage that makes us human. We salute all veterans and their families for their service and sacrifice, and we honor the four-legged heroes who serve alongside them, proving every day that loyalty, courage, and love are the forces that ultimately triumph over darkness and corruption.